My wife said she was traveling with friends. I found 2 tickets and sent them to my lawyer, and then he filed for divorce, and in that moment, something inside me broke silently. I didn't ask for an explanation. I just let the facts speak for themselves. When she returned, she was no longer mine. "You lied to live something that destroyed what was real," was all I said. Time passed, and with it, I found a new love, someone who walks by my side with sincerity and dedication. She discovered that her lover didn't want commitment, only escape, and was left with only regret. Recently, she wrote to me apologizing. I responded with a calm heart, I forgave. But then I introduced her to my new partner, and that's when her penny dropped. What I saw in her eyes that night wasn't anger. It was the silent panic of someone realizing they've lost something. But not something you lose like an object, an antique watch, or a memory tucked away in an envelope yellowed with time. She lost a home. She lost the version of herself that only existed when she was by my side. And the most tragic thing of all is that there was no longer room for her to return. What had been built with affection, respect, and loyalty no longer belonged to him. And she knew it. He knew it the moment he saw the new woman hold my hand. Not possessively, not insecurely, but with a silent calm that only exists between two who truly recognize each other. The old one no longer had room. I used to think that betrayal was an act of outburst, of impulse, of ego. But I discovered that, in fact, it's built silently. It's a sequence of small choices made in the shadows, far from the other person's gaze. A compliment kept, a message erased, an encounter justified with an easy lie. And lie after lie, the real is eroded. And the person sleeping next to you becomes just a memory of what you once were, no longer a present, much less a future. I remember the moment I opened the dresser drawer and saw 2 tickets. She had said she was traveling with her friends. And there, right there, before my eyes, the truth opened like a dry cut. The kind of cut that doesn't bleed immediately, but within seconds begins to burn as if fire were being poured from within. I took the tickets, took a photo, and sent it to my lawyer. Then I closed the drawer with the serenity of someone who had already understood everything. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. There was no scandal. Just the muffled sound of something breaking inside. It was the end. When she returned, silence was our only dialogue for days. Until one morning, while drinking coffee, she tried to kiss me. I recoiled. "You lied to live something that destroyed what was real," was all I could say. And she knew. She knew there was no going back. She knew that the time she thought she had already been consumed by her own mistakes. And from that moment on, everything changed. The hardest part of betrayal isn't the pain. The pain comes later. The cruelest part is the displacement. You find yourself living next to someone who suddenly no longer smells like home. Their touch doesn't comfort. Their gaze doesn't soothe. Every word sounds like a desperate attempt to return to something already lost to time. And then you understand that love doesn't die overnight. It rots slowly, like fruit forgotten in a bowl. It withers silently, until one day you realize there's nothing left worth saving. That's when I started walking the streets again. Not in search of another woman. But in search of myself. I started listening to the music I'd heard before I met her. I reconnected with friends. I resumed projects I'd abandoned to make her life fit into mine. I began to remember who I was before molding myself to the expectations of someone who, in the end, chose to live another story without even telling me. And in the midst of this silent process of reconstruction, someone appeared. She appeared without promises, without haste. With sincere eyes and a lightness I had forgotten existed. She didn't ask about my past, didn't demand answers. She simply walked beside me. She listened to me. She respected me. She touched me with truth. And it was in that touch that I understood what I had lost even before being betrayed, myself. And then, I also understood that love doesn't have to be a battlefield to be real. It can be light. It can be calm. It can be sincere. Months later, she wrote me. The old one. He sent a long, painful message. He said he even missed the sound of my breathing. That he remembered my scent on the pillow. That he was afraid of regretting it, and yet he did. That the other man didn't want anything serious. That he'd never looked at her the way I did. And that she now saw everything clearly. That she'd thrown away the only love that had ever been true. He apologized. He asked for forgiveness. And I forgave. Because there was no more pain in me. No more anger. No more love. Only memory. And memory, when overcome, leaves room for forgiveness. I calmly told her that it was okay. That I understood. That I, too, was wrong to believe that love resisted any choice. And that sometimes the mistake isn't in failing, but in lying. I told her she could move on in peace. That I wished her to find herself again. That she would forgive herself too. But then, perhaps on impulse, perhaps out of hope, she asked me if there was a chance we could start over. And in that moment, I looked at the woman now walking beside me. And I smiled. A calm, firm smile, full of truth. And I simply answered, no. The following week, we met by chance. She and I. The old one. It was brief. But enough. Her eyes were swollen. She hugged me tightly, as if holding within me one last time what she already knew she had lost. And she said, "You were my home. I only understood that when I lost you." I didn't answer. I just looked at her. Because sometimes, the pain is so deep it can't be put into words. And there, in her eyes, I saw true regret. The weight of emptiness. The loneliness that comes when you realize what you once had is irreversible. But life goes on. And I went on. Today she lives alone. And I know that sometimes, in the early hours of the morning when silence screams louder than sleep, she opens the old box of memories we left behind. Inside are letters from me, notes, movie tickets, black and white photos of us. And every time she opens that box, she sees again a love that was hers and, by her own choice, is no longer hers. A love that wasn't ripped away, wasn't lost, but rather discarded. They traded real love for an illusion of adventure. And every illusion, one day, demands the price of being undone. And now, what remains for her is not hate, not longing. It's a bitter recognition, that there is no new beginning when the ending was decided by one's own choice, without considering the consequences. What remains for her is to live with the memory of a love that was whole, sincere, true, but that couldn't resist the lie. And one day, when she sees me again, maybe in a cafe, maybe on the street, maybe in her dreams, she will see the man she let go. And maybe, in that moment, she will understand the cruelest truth of all. Love doesn't die when it ends. It dies when it's betrayed. And what she doesn't yet know, is what was inside the box she left at the back of the closet. The one thing I purposely left there before I left. What she finds in that last layer of memories might change everything she thought she knew about what she truly lost. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize or justify betrayal. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry hard truths about choices, consequences, and irreparable losses. Our purpose is clear: to show how betrayal can destroy true loves and transform entire lives into regret. Now take a deep breath. Get ready to hear an intense, realistic and shocking. Because after today, you will never look at the word cheating the same way again. Lucas and Helena met on an ordinary September afternoon, the kind when the wind carries an inexplicable calm and the sky seems bluer than usual. Their encounter wasn't one of those cinematic encounters, but it had the delicacy of a moment that leaves its mark without warning. She was leaving a small bookstore with a book of poetry pressed to her chest, and he, distracted by a coffee in his hand, tripped on the sidewalk and dropped the papers he was carrying. She bent down to help, their eyes met, and for an instant, time seemed to slow down. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was a connection at the first exchange. Helena had a calm presence, a soft voice that contrasted with the intensity of her eyes. Lucas, on the other hand, was introspective but observant, the kind who notices details others miss. He noticed that she always wore a ring on the index finger of her right hand and that she wrinkled her nose when she laughed. She noticed that he had a habit of looking at the floor when he talked about himself, as if he hadn't yet learned to put himself at the center of anything. As the months passed, they grew closer unhurriedly, building something solid and rare in the fast-paced world they lived in. Weekends became simple rituals, long breakfasts, silent walks, conversations that delved deeply and sometimes didn't require words. Lucas wasn't one for grand gestures, but in every action there was a sincerity that enchanted Helena. He learned to cook her favorite recipes, wrote notes and hid them between the pages of her books, attended to the small details with a tenderness that often said more than any declaration. Helena, in turn, brought color to his life. She painted watercolors with landscapes that only existed in her head, enjoyed French music, and danced barefoot in the living room when she thought no one was looking. They weren't perfect, and perhaps that's why they worked so well. They understood each other's silences, respected their absences, and celebrated their presences. Their story unfolded with the same patience expected of life when you know something good deserves time. They lived in a small but vibrant apartment, filled with paintings she made and books scattered throughout. Their routine was peaceful but never monotonous. Each had their own space, their own worlds, but they always returned to the same common ground, affection. Helena was a literature teacher at a local school and had a strong connection with her students. She often said that teaching was also a form of healing. Lucas worked in architecture and spent hours drawing models that, for him, were more than buildings, they were projected dreams. Their house had a bookshelf they shared like an altar, where they placed meaningful objects, their first movie ticket, a rock they found on a trip to the mountains, an old photograph taken with an analog camera. Each object had a story, and each story was a reminder that love is also built on the little things. On birthdays, they exchanged letters instead of gifts. They wrote about what they'd learned from each other, about fears overcome, setbacks experienced side by side, dreams yet to be achieved. It was a silent pact to continue choosing each other every day, even when routine tried to steal their charm. Friends called them the couple that gives hope, and even though they didn't like to carry that title, they knew there was something between them that wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just passion, nor just partnership. It was a rare blend of care, respect, and intimacy built over time, with listening, with conscious choices. They had plans, of course. They talked about having a child in the future, about traveling more, about maybe buying a house with a garden. But they were never ones to be tied to deadlines. They liked to let life unfold in its own time. They believed that mature love doesn't need to be about rushing, but about presence. But even the best planted loves can suffer with the changing seasons. Helena began to show signs of fatigue, a more distant look at times, a rush that hadn't existed before. Lucas, always attentive, understood, but chose not to pressure. I believe that we all go through phases and that the best thing you can do for someone is to offer space while still being close. She said she was overwhelmed, that work was consuming her, that she needed time for herself. He respected this. He began leaving shorter notes, making coffee she didn't drink, waiting for nights she spent away. Gaps began to appear in the routine, empty spaces in the conversation, silences that were no longer comfortable. Lucas tried to fill the voids with more love, with more attention. But there was something in the way she looked at him, or stopped looking at him, that caused him a new discomfort, as if he were becoming invisible within his own story. Still, he kept believing. Because their love was strong. Because they had history. Because he remembered the days she cried in his lap for fear of the future, the days he got sick and she stayed by his side, the late nights they talked about everything, the spontaneous laughter that came out of nowhere. It was impossible for him to imagine that all of it could be fading away. Helena said she was tired, that she needed to reconnect with herself. He supported her. He told her to take a weekend with her friends, breathe new air. He trusted her. He always had. He believed that love doesn't require surveillance, but freedom. And she seemed grateful for that. At least, that's what he thought. In the weeks that followed, she began traveling more frequently. She said she needed time, silence, to listen to herself. And he, believing her, stayed. He took care of the house, did the shopping, responded to her messages lovingly, prepared surprises for her return. He jotted down ideas for their next trip, wrote about missing her in his notebook, and waited. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch at night, listening to the playlist she'd made for him months earlier. He remembered their first dance on that same porch, with the string lights and the music low, both of them awkward but smiling. He wondered if love changed or just hid sometimes. He didn't want to believe he was losing someone he still called home. He looked at the photos on the shelf and searched for answers. He thought about the time they spent building that life, the choices made so carefully. He wondered how something so strong could be weakening for no clear reason. Doubt was beginning to grow, but he still wouldn't let it dominate. He believed that all love goes through phases of silence, of distance, of reinvention. He was willing to wait. To fight. To rebuild. Because when you truly love someone, you don't give up at the first crack. You try to understand, try to glue the pieces together. He just didn't know that sometimes the pieces don't stick together anymore because someone is already trying to piece together a different story somewhere else. The ironic thing is that, even with all the signs, Lucas still smiled when he talked about her. He told his friends they were going through a difficult time, but that everything would get better. That she just needed space. That this was common in long-term relationships. And maybe it was. Maybe it was just a phase. But there was something in the air that wasn't the same anymore. A scent of the end creeping through the cracks. An absence that, even unspoken, already filled the living room, the bedroom, the bed. But he didn't know it yet. And she, perhaps, had already forgotten how good it felt to be loved by someone who knew how to listen to her even in the silence. Helena returned from her trips different. More distant. More distracted. But she still had moments of tenderness. Sometimes she'd lie on his lap and tell him she loved him. Sometimes she'd laugh at something he said. Sometimes she'd seem to return. And it was in these moments that Lucas clung to her. As if each gesture were proof that there was still hope. That it was still possible. That love hadn't been buried, just dormant. And it is exactly in this place, between hope and emptiness, between affection and doubt, that everything begins to transform. And what is yet to happen, no one is prepared to hear. For weeks, Lucas tried to hold in his own hand something that was already slipping through his fingers like dry sand. He'd stopped counting the days Helena would leave without giving many details and return late, with excuses ranging from unexpected meetings to dinners with coworkers. The naturalness with which she spoke each sentence was what hurt him most, as if his presence had ceased to be something to consider. And yet, he smiled, prepared dinner, asked how the day had been, and listened to answers that came short, muttered, as if she were too busy with what she wasn't saying. Time seemed to stretch inside that house that now echoed more silence than words, and Lucas began to talk to objects, to the plants on the balcony, to the lampshade she claimed to hate but which he kept, as if it were still a symbol of some silent resistance. Little by little, the absence stopped being a novelty and became routine. Helena started going out on the weekends, claiming she needed air, space, to breathe in different landscapes. Sometimes she said she was going to meet her friends, sometimes simply that she needed to be alone. Lucas didn't question her, not because he didn't want to, but because he feared that by asking too much, she would say in so many words what he still refused to accept. He preferred the cruel comfort of doubt to the definitive blow of truth. And as she walked away, he shrank within himself, searching in his own actions for some answer to her distance. He cooked her favorite dishes, arranged the books on the shelf alphabetically just because she once said she'd like it that way, changed the sheets more often, bought her flowers, even though he knew they no longer enchanted her as they once did. But what hurt most was realizing that, despite all her gestures, she no longer saw him. Her eyes, once filled with light when she saw him, now passed over him like someone looking at a familiar piece of furniture, necessary, but expressionless. And it was in this emptiness, this nameless abyss, that Lucas began to notice small details he'd previously ignored: the new perfume that wasn't hers, the calls answered in a rush, the cell phone that was now always kept face down. And even with all this, he still tried to justify, rationalize, pretend to himself it was just a phase, that all couples go through winters and that spring would soon return. But deep down, a silent instinct was already screaming inside him, and he knew something was being hidden right before his eyes. One night, Helena left, saying she was spending the weekend at a country house with 2 childhood friends. She said she needed to disconnect, that she was feeling suffocated by the city, by her commitments, by everything. Lucas nodded with a resigned smile and wished her a good rest. After she left, he stood for a while on the porch, watching the cloudy sky. There was something about that night that weighed more heavily than the others. And without knowing why, he decided to tidy up the house. He opened cabinets, organized drawers, cleaned corners she usually ignored. Then, while rummaging through the dresser where they kept documents and passports, he found something that made him freeze: 2 recently dated bus tickets, leaving the city for a coastal destination. 2 tickets. Round trip. Same destination. Same time. Same seat next to each other. For a moment, he thought there might be some innocent explanation, some absurd coincidence. But the mind, when faced with the abyss, is quicker than the heart wants to accept. He took the notes, sat on the sofa, and stared at that piece of paper as if seeing the beginning of an answer he doesn't want to find. Her name was there. The other name was unknown. And that was when everything fell into place, or, rather, everything fell apart. The absences. The excuses. The distant look. The rush to leave. The hidden cell phone. The different perfume. The tone of voice laden with a lightness that didn't include him. And there, on that sofa, Lucas felt the world change temperature. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rage. It was a thick, dense silence that enveloped him completely. It was as if all the love he'd built with her had been pushed off a cliff before his eyes, and he didn't even have time to run for it. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just got up, took a picture of the notes with his cell phone, and sent it to the lawyer with a short text: "We can move forward with the case." After that, he turned off his cell phone, locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat for hours in the dim living room, listening to the ticking of the wall clock she had chosen. Every second felt like an accusation, every sound a reminder of what had been and would never be again. He spent that night awake. In the morning, he made coffee, read the newspaper, and went for a walk as if life were still the same. But something inside him had changed forever. He was no longer the man he'd been. No longer the man who waited with faith. He was someone who now knew what it was like to be deceived by the one he loved. And this certainty was as bitter as it was definitive. When Helena returned from her supposed trip, she found the house tidy, fresh flowers on the table, and a silence that seemed to have transformed into furniture. Lucas greeted her with a calm, almost cold look. He didn't ask how it was. He didn't say he missed her. He just observed. She talked a lot, as if trying to fill with words a space already occupied by something else. He just listened. Until, in an almost symbolic gesture, she put her bag on the floor and went to hug him. He stepped back, with a subtle movement, and said with a calmness that made her tremble inside, "You lied to live something that destroyed what was real." That was it. No shouting. No more questions. No accusations. Just that sentence, spoken so clearly it felt like a mirror being held up to her. Helena didn't respond immediately. Her face changed. Her body swayed. For the first time, the silence was hers. She sat up, held her hands, and tried to say something, but he pulled away before her. He went to his room, closed the door, and let her, for the first time, feel the weight of the emptiness she'd created. In the days that followed, the distance between them became more than physical. It was emotional. It was permanent. Lucas no longer looked at her the way he used to. And despite trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, she knew something inside him had been ripped away. She tried to talk, but found only kindness. She tried to touch, but felt only respect. She tried to get closer, but encountered an invisible wall of disappointment. And that was when she began to understand that perhaps she had lost something she hadn't realized how valuable it was until she found herself outside, looking in, a house that was still hers but no longer home. Lucas didn't bring up the subject. He didn't ask for explanations. He let the facts speak for themselves. She tried to justify it with rehearsed phrases, but he didn't want to hear it. He didn't need to. Because there was a huge difference between knowing and accepting. And he had already accepted it. The end. The loss. The reality. There was no scandal. There was no dramatic farewell. Just the feeling that something had been ended without the chance to be rewritten. And in that silence, in that unspoken ending, he began to rediscover himself. Walking new streets, breathing different air, listening to music she'd never liked. He began to occupy the spaces he'd previously ceded. He began, slowly, to live. And meanwhile, Helena's conscience was beginning to eat away at her. She looked at him and no longer saw the man she'd seen before. She saw someone who followed. Who was rising. Who didn't hate her, but who also no longer wanted her. And that, for her, was the worst kind of end. The one that comes with forgiveness, but without return. She didn't yet know, however, that there was something more. Something he'd discovered but kept to himself. Something he hadn't said. Something he'd preferred to keep silent. But when it came to light, it would change everything. Even what little remained of what had once been love. The morning was cloudy when Helena decided to go to her old apartment. The divorce had been filed weeks earlier, and the silence between them had become civilized, almost respectful, like two strangers sharing a common memory but no longer a present. She had said she would return to retrieve some boxes of her things, forgotten objects, clothes, books, and, most importantly, an old wooden box stored in the back of the closet. Lucas didn't object. He left the key with the doorman and left early, avoiding any direct encounter. Not out of spite, but because he had learned that some presences only hurt when they reappear, trying to appear harmless. Helena entered the house with a tightness in her chest that she couldn't name. Everything was different. The walls were a different color, the furniture had been rearranged, and the energy seemed renewed, as if the space had been cleansed of everything she had once represented. She walked slowly to the bedroom, opened the closet, and found the box. It was smaller than she remembered, made of dark wood, locked with a small gold padlock. And next to it, a note folded in four. She held the paper with trembling hands. She didn't immediately recognize the handwriting, but she knew who it was as soon as she read the first line. It was from Lucas. A letter. She took a deep breath before opening it. The words came like a silent storm, a wound opening from the inside out. If you're reading this, it's because you decided to come back here for something you've forgotten. And maybe, deep down, what you left behind wasn't this box, but the truth. I needed to keep quiet for a while, not out of cowardice, but because I knew there were things that needed to be digested before they could be said. And now, maybe it's time for you to know what really hurt. Helena sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, the letter between her fingers, her heart pounding. She continued reading. Those passages I found weren't the only thing that alerted me. Do you remember the night you left your laptop open in the living room? I went to close the lid and, by a cruel twist of fate or perhaps the justice of the universe, the email was still open. Not just yours. But his too. His lover's. He would text you in the wee hours of the morning, and you would respond with words you never used with me. I read everything. Every line. Every detail. And what destroyed me most wasn't learning of the betrayal, but understanding that he was someone who had been in our lives before. She stopped reading, her hands on her face, trying to contain the rising nausea. The note continued. Do you remember my birthday 2 years ago? When I made that dinner here at home and invited some people from work? One of them was him. The man you cheated on me with. He squeezed my hand, looked me in the eyes, toasted me. And that night, you went to sleep next to me, as if nothing was happening. Only it was already happening. Helena cringed, pulling her knees to her chest. This was more than she could bear. He knew. He had known for a long time. And yet, he hadn't said anything. I didn't want to destroy what little dignity remained between us. That's why I chose not to confront you. I wanted to see how far you would go with your lies. And you went far. You lied with your eyes, with your gestures, with your body. You traveled. You created stories. You covered your tracks. But you forgot that the truth always comes back, even when we try to bury it. I forgave the betrayal long before I told you I knew. Because I understood that the blame wasn't just yours. It was mine too, for having loved alone for longer than I should have. The paper trembled in her hands, now wet with the tears that flowed uncontrollably. In the box were photos of the two of them, old notes, concert tickets, drawings she'd made for him, letters he'd written but never delivered. And at the bottom of the box, a printed photo, the image of her lover and her, taken from afar, smiling on a beach. A picture Lucas had taken. He'd seen it with his own eyes. Photographed with his own hands. And he'd kept it. Not for revenge, but as a scar he chose to bear in silence. When I saw you with him on that beach, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. Because I realized that, while I was fighting to save something real, you were choosing to hide behind an illusion. He wasn't better than me. He was just a novelty. And novelty, my dear, fades. But true love, that lasts. And you let love slip through your fingers. Helena stood there, motionless, for long minutes. Time seemed to stand still. The weight of the letter, the box, the truth, everything crashed down on her with a force that crushed the air from her lungs. She remembered every gesture Lucas had made in the past few weeks. His silence. His calm. His dignity. And she realized it all came from someone who had already accepted the end, but still respected her enough not to humiliate her. This hurt more than any fight. More than any scream. It was the kind of pain that comes from shame. From acknowledging a mistake. And, most of all, from the knowledge that it was too late. When he left the apartment, the box in his arms and his eyes swollen, he felt smaller than ever. In the days that followed, he wrote a long message. He asked for forgiveness. He didn't try to justify it. He simply said he now understood what he had done. And that it hurt to know there was no going back. He responded simply but profoundly, I forgive you. I truly do. But forgiving isn't going back. It's letting go. And after that, silence. Weeks later, the two accidentally bumped into each other in a cafe. He was with another woman. His gaze was serene. Happy. She watched from afar, without approaching. And she saw the way he smiled at his new companion, the lightness of his gestures, the care with which he touched her hand across the table. It cut deep. Because now she understood that the love she had wasted was there, alive, but in other hands. And that there was nothing more to be done. But there was something Lucas hadn't yet told anyone. Something he'd blurted out in a single sentence during a dinner with friends, which she, coincidentally, had overheard without him knowing. And it was there, in that matter-of-fact sentence, that she finally understood everything, and what he discovered before he left her is perhaps the most painful part of the whole story. That night, Helena didn't sleep. She paced the small apartment, which now seemed even smaller, stifled by memories that refused to go away. The wooden box rested on the table, open, like an exposed wound. Everything weighed on her, the photo, the letters, Lucas's firm, honest handwriting, the smell of the papers aged by time and affection. The silence of the early morning wasn't a relief, it was a mirror. And there, alone, facing for the first time the true dimension of what she had destroyed, she realized that the greatest betrayal hadn't been against him, but against herself. For so long, she believed she was seeking freedom, novelty, a respite, but what she found was a void that filled nothing. And now, when there was nothing left, she felt the bitter taste of what she had lost on impulse. 2 days later, driven by a need she couldn't explain, she decided to look for him. Not because she wanted to win him back, that had already become unattainable, but because she felt the need to look into his eyes and, perhaps, find some trace of the woman she'd once loved there. She waited until late afternoon and went to the park where he used to walk. She knew the times, the paths, the benches where he liked to sit with a coffee in hand. When she saw him, something inside her gave way. Lucas was different. His gaze was different. Gone was the shadow she'd previously known she'd caused. He was at peace. He walked with light steps, head held high, as if he'd finally found his center. "Can I sit?" she asked hesitantly when he stopped next to an empty bench. He stared at her for a second that felt longer than any previous silence between them. He nodded briefly. She sat down beside him, leaving space between them. A physical space that reflected exactly what separated them now on the inside. "I found the box," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Lucas didn't answer right away. He watched the movement of the leaves around him, as if weighing each word before offering it. "I knew you would find it. I thought you needed to see it for yourself." "See?" she repeated, with a short, bitter laugh. "I saw more than I deserved. You knew everything, and yet you looked at me with respect. Because respect is the least that can be maintained when love can no longer exist." He replied, finally looking into her eyes, "I couldn't do to you what you did to me." Helena lowered her gaze, feeling the words like small cuts. But there was no escape now. Everything was already exposed. All that remained was to face reality with the same courage with which she had destroyed the past. "You said you forgave me," she said, staring at the floor. "But I have to ask. Why? After everything, why didn't you hate me?" Lucas took a deep breath. There was something in the tone of the question that made him cringe, but he answered with the calmness of someone who had finally let go of the burden. "Because hate would keep me tied to you. And I needed to free myself. Not from what you did, but from what I felt. And also because I understood that you betrayed me even before the other. You betrayed yourself. You stopped being yourself and started searching for something outside that always existed inside. And when we understand this, forgiveness comes as a respite." She couldn't hold back the tears. They fell silently, filled with a regret that sought no compassion, only understanding. Lucas didn't touch her. He didn't offer comfort. And that was precisely what touched her most. Because he was no longer hers. And the silence between them was no longer a pause between words, it was the end of the conversation. "There's something I heard," she said after a moment, wiping away her tears. "Something you said at dinner with your friends. A simple sentence, but it hit me like a bolt of lightning." Lucas frowned slightly, confused. She continued. "You said, it took losing her to find who I was before I loved too much. And I kept wondering, who was this man?" He smiled, a slight smile, but without joy. Just resignation. "A man who gave up on you every day. Who gave up space, silenced desires, overruled opinions, all in the name of a love he believed was enough for two. But love doesn't survive when it becomes constant renunciation. I lost myself trying to keep you. And only when I let you go did I understand that I, too, deserved someone who chose me with the same intensity one chose." She flinched slightly, as if the words echoed in a cramped room. It wasn't cruel. It was the truth. And the truth, when spoken without anger, is more cutting than any accusation. Then she looked at him with teary eyes and said something she'd never had the courage to admit. "I thought he would make me feel alive. I thought the new would heal what was lukewarm, but all I found was emptiness. And in the end, I was the one who destroyed myself." Lucas just nodded. Not as if he agreed, but as if he already knew. He'd already experienced that understanding weeks before. She was just arriving now, late to a place he no longer lived. "And now?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Are you happy with her now?" He took a deep breath, taking his time to respond. He wanted to choose his words carefully. "With her. I don't have to prove myself every day. I can be who I am, without fear of not being enough. It's not about comparing. It's about peace. And with her, everything is light. Even the silences." Helena closed her eyes. She wanted to disappear. She wanted that conversation to stop, but she knew it was necessary. It was the wound being cleaned before it healed. After a long silence, she stood up. Lucas followed her with his gaze. "I won't look for you anymore," she said, her firmness brittle. "But, if I ever have a daughter, I'll tell her about the man who loved me right. And how I destroyed that by thinking freedom meant running away, when, in fact, it meant staying." Lucas was silent. There was, in that moment, a silent affection. A shared grief. She took a step back, enough to close everything, and then turned. She walked away. And with each step, she left behind the woman who chose lies over truth. That night, Lucas returned home. He sat on the couch and looked at the new bookshelf he'd put together with his new partner. She was in the kitchen, humming a soft tune. When he entered, she smiled. A simple smile, full of life. And without saying a word, he hugged her. A long hug. Full of gratitude. Because sometimes, you have to see love being destroyed to, one day, recognize when it arrives again, this time, to stay. Life after such a profound rupture doesn't restart with fireworks or some grandiose sense of liberation, it continues silently, almost timidly, as if the days were groping in the dark, trying to figure out where the broken pieces fit together. Lucas moved forward with a calm that wasn't false, but earned. There was within him a maturity that hadn't existed before the pain, a kind of serenity that only arises after everything comfortable and predictable crumbles. The new woman by his side didn't occupy someone else's space, she wasn't a substitute, she was a new, clean choice, built on a different kind of love, conscious love. It was a relationship where both saw each other as whole, without fantasies of perfection, without the need to be saved, simply willing to walk side by side. And yet, even at peace, there was in Lucas a trace of contained melancholy, not for lack of love present, but for the undeclared mourning of something that was once true, albeit flawed, and that had a cruel end. Meanwhile, Helena slowly fell apart. Not in the scandalous way one might expect from a fall, but like someone who disappears from themselves a little each day. The world she knew became opaque, social relationships faded, old friends drifted away without saying goodbye, and even work, which had once occupied so much space, began to seem like a distant backdrop. There was a new absence within her, a void that refused to be filled. She tried to reconnect with art, with music, with literature, but it all felt artificial, as if she had lost the ability to truly feel emotion. She didn't seek another relationship, didn't try to fill the space Lucas left with new adventures. For the first time, she was alone with her own conscience. And there, in the silence of her own company, she was forced to face the person she had become. There was a suffocating moral dilemma: how can you live in peace with who you were when you know this version of yourself was forged on a lie? The dilemma was cruel, not only because of the regret, but because there was no way to fix it. Everything that could have been said would no longer make a difference. No letter, no tears, no explanation would redeem what had been destroyed. But still, she felt a genuine need to transform that pain into something other than mere ruin. She began to write. Not with the intention of showing it to anyone, but as a way to document the internal process she was experiencing. She wrote about thoughtless choices, about the disguised lack of freedom, about the illusion that novelty is always more vivid than what one already has. And in this painful exercise, she began to see herself with an honesty she had never practiced. For the first time, she didn't try to justify her actions, didn't try to paint herself as a victim of circumstances. She acknowledged what she had done, and worse, she acknowledged what she had lost, not as a punishment, but as a consequence. Lucas, for his part, was beginning to rediscover nuances in his own life. Small gestures like assembling furniture with his new partner, sharing a movie on the couch, or cooking together on Sundays became meaningful rituals. But there was something different about him now. He was no longer the man who threw himself into everything without protection. Now, he loved with presence, but also with discernment. He had learned that love, to be healthy, must be reciprocal in effort, in care, in truth. And even with all the peace he experienced, there were days when it was inevitable to remember the past. Not with pain, but with a strange kind of longing, not for the person, but for naivete. It was the longing for believing that love alone was enough. Now he knew it wasn't. That love must walk hand in hand with conscious choices, with loyalty, with the courage to face boredom, routines, and silences. One warm afternoon, while sorting through old papers, he found an envelope with a last letter he had never sent. It was addressed to Helena. He debated for a moment whether to tear it up, burn it, or throw it away. But something made him reread every line. The letter contained no accusations, no resentment. It was a kind of emotional testament, written at the precise moment he realized she would never again be the woman he fell in love with. In one passage, it said, "I had to accept that even though I loved you, it was possible you wouldn't choose me. And that didn't make my love any less, just more lucid. And today, if I leave you, it's because I finally understood that loving myself is also an act of courage." As he reread those words, he felt a slight tug, like a distant echo. He no longer needed to send it. That letter was a reliquary of a past he had already overcome. Across town, Helena decided to publish some of her writing anonymously. She created a discreet blog, without photos, names, or references. There she wrote everything she'd never said out loud. The space became a kind of modern confessional, where she exposed layers of guilt, regret, loss, and learning. Her writing began to be shared and commented on, and although she never revealed her identity, she began receiving messages from others who had experienced similar stories, some from the side of the betrayed, others from the side of the betrayer. This didn't redeem her, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Knowing that, even anonymously, I could warn others about the dangers of unconscious choices gave purpose to the pain. There was a specific day when Lucas read one of these texts. He didn't know it was hers. But something about the way the words were arranged, the emotional depth, the raw honesty, struck him as familiar. When he finished reading, he fell silent for a few minutes. He realized that, even without knowing it, they still shared something. Not a life, not a love, but a piece of learning that now touched other lives. And this brought him an unexpected peace. The certainty that, somehow, they had both transformed that painful end into something other than ashes. The new woman in his life realized, over time, that there was an unresolved past emotionally, not for lack of overcoming, but out of respect. And this didn't scare her. She knew that loving someone who was broken isn't about competing with what came before, but about understanding that true love is built not on denying the past, but on accepting it. Lucas never hid what he'd experienced. He told his story with the truth he'd learned to carry. And precisely because of this, the love that blossomed between them was different. More mature. More whole. Less idealized, but much deeper. The moral dilemma persisted, on another level. Both Lucas and Helena had to ask themselves if it was possible to move on completely when they knew that the person who left, in some way, still carried what was broken. The answer came not in words, but in decisions. Lucas continued his life with presence and affection. Helena chose not to engage in any further relationships until she felt whole enough to offer something fair to someone. Neither of them turned back, because they knew that true love, the kind built with sacrifice and truth, cannot be revived once it is violated. It can be respected, remembered, transformed, but never rekindled. And it was in this new place, where wounds heal silently and choices carry more weight than words, that they both found what they'd always been searching for. Not a new chance at their old love, but a chance to be better, more conscious, more authentic people. An encounter with their own essence after having lost themselves trying to live up to expectations that never made sense. There was only one chapter left for everything to truly make sense. Something that still needed to happen. One final gesture. A definitive closure. And when it finally came, it wouldn't just be an ending, it would be a liberation. Autumn arrived without fanfare, as if merely continuing the rhythm of everything that had transformed in recent months. The leaves began to fall almost silently, trailing along the sidewalks and gathering in the corners of parks, on the edges of sidewalks, in places where footsteps avoid stepping. It was precisely on one of those more melancholy afternoons, with the sky coppery and the city smothered in a dense stillness, that Helena received the invitation. A simple envelope, with no apparent sender, discreetly left at the entrance of the building where she now lived. Inside, a card with familiar handwriting and an address. It was the newly opened art gallery downtown, where, according to the note, Lucas would exhibit for the first time a personal project that had been quietly maturing. The message was brief, direct, but there was something intimate about it. There was no formal invitation, no request. Just a delicately written sentence: "If you want to see what's left of everything, I'll be there. You don't have to say anything. Just come if you feel you must." It took her 3 days to decide. The envelope sat on the living room table, motionless, but charged with a meaning that weighed heavily on every corner of the house. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't want to intrude on a new space that no longer included her, but curiosity, the still-present affection, and that almost irrational desire to understand what still pulsed within her led her, at the end of the third day, to choose the blue dress he used to say suited her and go to the gallery. When she arrived, the gallery was full, but the atmosphere was calm. People walked among the works in silence, respecting the space as if entering a temple. In the center of the main room hung a series of black and white photographs, all seemingly ordinary at first glance: empty streets, clasped hands, blurred eyes, details of everyday life. But each carried a short, almost whispered caption. "Before the silence. Last look before the fall. The gesture no one saw." And finally, the last one, a photograph of a woman sitting on the edge of the bed, seen from behind, her dress falling off her shoulders. The caption: "The last image of a love that is complete before it breaks." Helen stood before the latter for a long time. Her body felt light and heavy at the same time. She knew it was her. She knew that image wasn't captured by chance. And she didn't feel invaded. She felt pierced. This wasn't about revenge. It was about testimony. About preserving, somehow, what once existed and could now only be counted as memory. When she turned to leave, he was there, beside one of the columns, talking to a dark-haired woman who smiled naturally. He saw her, and for a second, he just watched, unhurried, as if he'd already known she was coming. He said goodbye to the woman with a gentle gesture and walked toward Helena with the same calm with which he'd always approached her at all the important moments in her life. "I didn't think you would come," he said, without irony, without expectation. "Me neither," she replied honestly. "But I needed to see it. Not the exhibition, you." Lucas nodded slightly, and they walked together to a smaller room in the gallery, where there were fewer people. There, they sat on 2 rustic wooden benches, side by side, not touching, but with their shoulders close enough for them to feel each other's warmth. The silence lasted a few minutes, until she took a deep breath. "I read one of your articles in the newspaper. That column about loves that never return. It was you, wasn't it? It was, he answered simply. I was only able to write that after I understood that longing can also be transformed into respect. I never thanked you for being so whole with me. Not even when I didn't deserve it. He looked into her eyes. There was a different glow there, no longer the glow of a man in love, but of a man who has learned to protect himself. Even so, the look still held kindness. I also never thanked you for making me discover how far I was willing to go for love. How far I was willing to forget myself to keep what I believed was right. And as much as it hurt, today I see that it was necessary for you to leave like that so that I could finally come back to myself. She smiled, a sad, honest smile. I spent months trying to understand why I did what I did. And the more I thought, the more I realized there was no fair explanation. I was looking for something outside, when what I really wanted was to find myself inside. Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, thoughtful. And did you succeed? Not completely yet, she said. But I stopped running. And I started looking inward with more courage. It was hard. It still is. But it's more honest than pretending nothing happened. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was mature. It was the silence of someone who has finally grasped the weight of what they've experienced. The kind of silence that only exists between two people who truly loved each other but no longer have the space to continue. Helena watched him sideways, admiring the lightness with which he now occupied his own body, the way his hands moved as he spoke, the evident peace in his gestures. There was nothing of her there anymore. And that was painful, but also necessary. Are you happy? He asked, without bitterness. Lucas smiled serenely. I'm at peace. And peace, for me, has always been what I've been missing most in recent years. Happiness comes and goes, but peace. I've learned to protect that. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Not because she wanted to return, but because she realized that the love she'd lost wasn't just his, it was hers too. The love she'd had inside her and chosen to abandon out of fear, out of immaturity, out of seeking outside what would never have been far from the truth. She reached out, briefly touching his hand, a gesture more symbolic than any words. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. He squeezed her hand for a second and responded tenderly. May you find yourself again. Completely. Helen got up and left. She didn't turn around. She didn't cry as she left the gallery. She simply walked with firm, conscious steps, as if she knew she was leaving behind not just a story, but a version of herself that no longer served her. Lucas watched her walk away with a serenity that only comes when one finally understands that forgiving isn't forgetting, but rather freeing oneself. He stayed there for a while longer, then returned to the main room, where his new companion was waiting. When she saw him, she smiled. He smiled back, and silently, they walked out hand in hand, without needing to say anything. The past had finally served its purpose. The final page was being written. And soon, everything would make sense. Time passed with the same indifference with which the world turns for those who suffer a silent loss. Lucas and Helena went their separate ways, not out of resentment, but because of one of those inevitable decisions that needn't be spoken aloud. Their story, though closed, left lasting marks, scars that don't bleed but that change how each of them views love from then on. The meeting in the gallery had sealed the last chance of any remaining bond between them. And, ironically, it was there that the last spark of shared humanity was born, not to rekindle something, but to illuminate what had already been. After that day, they no longer spoke. No messages, no waves, no attempts to renew ties that now belonged only to memory. It was as if the universe, out of respect for their mutual grief, had placed them at opposite ends of the road, allowing only one last look before closing the door to the past for good. Lucas blossomed. Not suddenly, but with the patience of someone who spent too much time fading away to please someone else. Alongside his new partner, he rediscovered the small rituals that build true bonds, cooking in silence, planning trips without hiding, talking about fears without being judged, crying when necessary, laughing without apologizing. And most importantly, he learned to be loved without needing to be perfect. Their relationship was built on transparency, not performance. He could be fragile without it being interpreted as weakness. She admired him for who he was, not for what he did for her. Together, they opened a small studio in a quieter neighborhood, where he began teaching photography to vulnerable young people. It was a simple social project, but one that touched lives with the same sensitivity he carried in his gaze. There, Lucas not only rediscovered his purpose but left a silent legacy of reconstruction, of resilience against trauma, of a true new beginning. And when, years later, he was invited to publish a book with his records and reflections, he included in the dedication a phrase that only those who lived through it would understand: for those who learned that love, when real, also knows how to leave when necessary. Helena, on the other hand, delved deeply into her journey of self-discovery. She continued writing anonymously, and her texts became known in some literary circles as candid accounts of emotional self-sabotage. Without revealing her identity, she began to be sought out by publishers, readers, support groups, and psychologists. Her pain became a bridge for so many others who had never been able to name their own chaos. And even with this recognition, she carried a silent weight. It wasn't guilt, she had already forgiven herself. It was the understanding that certain choices cannot be undone, and that maturity sometimes means learning to live with the consequences of one's own actions without seeking redemption in another. She lived alone, not for lack of opportunities for a new beginning in love, but because she knew that, at that moment, no love would be fair if she hadn't yet realigned herself with what she expected of herself. Loneliness ceased to be punishment and became a place of construction. One night, during a lecture on the importance of truth in relationships, he ended his talk with an adapted quote: "People are not lost when they die, but when they lie about how they feel." Her lover, the one with whom it all began, continued his life as he had begun, on the run. He didn't build lasting bonds, didn't start a family, didn't settle down with anyone. Helena learned from distant sources that he had moved abroad, abandoning ties and routines. She didn't feel anger upon learning. She felt emptiness. An emptiness that only exists when we realize we've destroyed something real for something that was never whole. And it was in this feeling that she wrote perhaps the most impactful text of all, the one that would close the cycle of pain: betrayal is not the death of love, it is the denial of it. And those who deny what is real spend the rest of their lives trying to justify what they never had the courage to keep. The reunion never happened. Lucas didn't seek her out, Helena didn't insist. But one afternoon, at a book launch event for his book, a woman sat discreetly in the back of the audience. She didn't announce herself, didn't ask for attention. She simply listened. And when he finished talking about how a life can be rebuilt from its own ruin, she got up and left silently, before he saw her. Not because she didn't want to be noticed, but because, in that gesture, there was finally a respect that had been missing before, the awareness that she no longer belonged. In the end, their story didn't end with reunion, nor reconciliation, nor revenge. It ended with maturity. With learning. With the realization that not all loves last forever, but some leave scars that last a lifetime. Scars that no longer hurt, but that teach. Betrayal destroyed the love that existed, but it didn't erase what was felt. And that's the most human part of it all, knowing that even stories that end badly still have something beautiful to offer, even if it's just a lesson about what should never be done again. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What impacted you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you in any way, be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and don't miss the next episodes. The biggest lesson from this story is clear: betrayal doesn't just destroy the relationship, it erodes dignity, shatters trust, and, above all, kills the future that could have been built on truth. Those who betray not only break up with the other person, but also unravel in front of the mirror. Because lies are unsustainable, and sooner or later, everything falls apart. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. The stories here are fictional, but the feelings are real. The truth may hurt, but but lies destroy. Always choose love with loyalty. Choose to be true. Because betraying means losing much more than you can imagine.